Welcome everyone to this special episode of the Go Blended podcast. Today's topic is one of that's shaping how the world finances the future, the state of blended finance, both globally and here in Brazil. Joining me is Heiner from Convergence, the global network for blended finance, an organization that has been tracking and shaping this space for almost a decade. Thanks, Heiner, for being here with us.
Great to be here. Muito obrigado pelo convite, Douglas. Very excited to be able to talk to you for the next several minutes about the state of blended finance, where it's headed, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are.
Thank you very much, Heiner. Well, so Heiner, let's start big, okay? When you look at the global landscape, you guys are traveling all around the world, talking about global and blended finance. How would you describe where blended finance stands today? Are we still in the proof of concept phase, or has it truly entered the mainstream of development finance?
That's a great question, Doug, to get started. I would like to go back a little bit into maybe the beginnings of the millennium, where so much of the donor funding was channeled directly as aid through different institutions. And blended finance is not necessarily a new concept. So after the Millennium Development Goals, we had the SDGs, which were kicked off around 2015 at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And that's when Convergence was created. Convergence was created 10 years ago with the spirit of becoming the global network of blended finance. And we were funded by different governments and by different foundations. Our headquarters are in Toronto, and we have a global presence. And we work across three pillars of action in order to promote the blended finance system. One of those pillars has to do with the fact of being able to curate the different transactions that have reached financial close that are blended finance in nature, so that we can provide a reference, we can provide evidence, we can draw trends from what we've seen has occurred in the blended finance space across different regions, across different sectors. So that's one element that we look to for our data and for evidence-based examples and trends. The other one has to do with the fact that we provide trainings and capacity building for different institutions around blended finance. We write case studies and we promote webinars in order to be able to promote what blended finance is, what it isn't, when it can be used, when it cannot be used. So I guess it's a knowledge-sharing component, if you want to call that second pillar. And then thirdly, we also have the mandate of promoting and growing blended finance transactions in the market. And we do so by promoting new ideas that are coming by channeling donor funding via grants. They're not our funding, it's the funding of different donors who ask us to run the entire process of the request for proposals, for example, the evaluation of these new ideas, with the intent of supporting these ideas from maybe a economic perspective via the grants, but also via technical assistance and support, with the intent of having these new transactions go to market a little quicker, less expensive, and with the support that they require. So those are the three pillars that we work across. Long introduction to your question about whether we're exactly at the proof of concept phase or not. So based on the data that we've been gathering around 2012, around the trends that we have seen as far as collecting closed transactions has been on the upward, which is positive, and it has been increasing year to year. And it has been increasing across the SDGs, and it also has been increasing across the different regions. So today we have close to 1,600 transactions in our database, and that represents around $250 billion mobilized in blended finance transactions. And that also represents around 2,200 investors that have participated in some capacity in a blended finance structure. I think what has a not necessarily decreased, but it is not on a constant rise, for example, is what we call the whale transactions. And those whale transactions are the big blended finance transactions of $1 billion or more. Those are not on a sustainable path in the sense that we don't see that increasing sustainably. We still see those, but there's no specific trend that we can identify there as far as that gaining traction and that become the new modality of the size of the transactions. We published 2 reports every year, one in the spring and one in the fall now, and I invite everybody to visit our reports. They're accessible to the public.
Which
They're
are
called
pretty good, by the way.
Pardon,
I
thank
truly
you.
recommend.
Thank you very much. I will retransmit your message to our market insights team. And the idea is to capture what we call the state of blended finance. Actually, that's the name of our flagship report. One has a general state of blended finance, which shows what has been done in the past 10 years, but more specifically, what has been done in the last year, what the trends are, who the new participants are. And then we also have a climate edition, which was just released, which shows what are the trends and who are the participants as far as the climate lens or climate finance angle is concerned. So we are positive. I think it is no longer at a proof of stage. And based on all the conversations that I've had this week, both at PRI in person, for example, and the pre-COP events, blended finance is no longer a very strange term. Maybe it's not completely understood in full. Maybe it's not completely identified, which is okay. But at least it is now becoming more and more of a household name and a possible solution to mobilize resources and a possible solution in order to mobilize those resources to reduce that financing gap that exists.
That's really nice, Heiner. I would like to make a follow-up question on that's not here in the script, but your feeling from these past days here in Brazil. How do you see the Brazilian community around the blended finance subject, and what were your perceptions during the conversations, meetings that you had here for these past days?
I had the opportunity to be present and to contribute to a report for the B20 last year, which was in preparation or in parallel to the G20. So Brazil had the presidency last year. And this year hosting COP30 as well and the PRI in person, I think shows the momentum and the commitment from Brazilian authorities and the Brazilian community as a whole towards becoming and positioning Brazil as a world at a world stage and as a world leader as well, which is great, which is fantastic, because you do need that support, that you need the buy-in from both sides of the table. The public sector that has to create those regulations and that business enabling environment in order for you to be able to get transactions done. And you also have to have the energy, the focus, the commitment, the determination of the private sector in order to invest in these new solutions and in order to create that much needed pipeline, which is always a challenge everywhere, not just Brazil, but everywhere. And in that way, you have that perfect scenario where supply meets the demand of the capital that's needed. And that's when you start having theories of change kick in effectively. And then when you fast forward and you look back, you really have a completely different set of metrics that you can refer to. And the progress that has made. It's been fantastic. Everybody that I've spoken to is incredibly excited about having and positioning Brazil. When we look at the numbers of Brazil, it's 220 million people. It's a third of the Latin American population. It's huge. It's the 10th largest economy. If you look today, it might be the 9th tomorrow. Easily, you're there. So Brazil has a lot to offer in both natural resources, in human resource talent, and I think what's most important in the determination and the spirit of positioning Brazil as a world leader and a reference, not for just economic development, but for degrees of industrialization as well, and becoming a hub and a reference to channel financial resources.
That's really nice to hear, and I made this question because it's also very important for us as Brazilians to understand how you and other executives with this international and global landscape are seen in our country right now, and how the blended context is developing here. And I would like to zoom in on Brazil right now, on our question 2, okay? So moving forward, in Brazil, we have seen emerging initiatives, such as from what you just shared here, from the Fundo Clima and the BNDES, climate facilities to private structures like Regenera RS, which Dynamo has a partnership, and new collaborations with other institutions. When you look at the data, you mentioned some of the figures in the beginning of your speech, Heiner. Why does Latin America, in your perception, despite its relevance in natural capital and climate, still attracts so little blended capital compared to Africa or Asia, for example?
I think that's a fair comparison at the very beginning. When you start looking a little bit more at the current deals that are out there, let's not forget that we capture and then we reflect historic data.
Sure.
So there has been a lag perhaps in Latin America in the sense of the historic deals that have closed. But the data shows that at the beginning of the millennium, more funding and more catalytic capital and concessional capital was flowing to Africa. And that continues to be the case. However, I think the number of blended finance transactions flowing into Latin America is around 20%, between 18 and 20% of the global context.
I see.
Very similar to Asia, for example. Africa, if I'm not mistaken, is around 50%. It still contains the majority of the blended finance transactions. So I think it's not necessarily a competition of where we are.
Sure.
I think it's just a fact that we're taking a little longer to get these blended finance transactions to the market and the players more involved, again, because that initial focus of catalytic capital or concessional capital was predominantly in Africa, and now it is being focused on Asia and Latin America as well.
Sure, that's nice to hear. And what do you see, and what could somehow boost this dynamic here in Latin America, Heiner?
I think the challenges in order to boost more blended finance transactions are you need the government support and the business enabling environment. You need the regulation to go local regulation to begin with, and then we can think about regional regulation. But first, local. You have to support the benefits that a blended finance transaction brings to the table, and those benefits are de-risking. So, for example, if you are an investor, a commercial investor that wants to invest or participate or co-participate or co-design a blended finance transaction, but for some reason, because of the regulation that you have, the limitations that you have, whether you're a bank, whether you're an insurance company, whether you're a pension fund, you have limitations as far as how that investment is treated from an accounting perspective, or even maybe from a fiduciary perspective, which is more from the shareholder. That's not so much from the business and the living. But if there is some restriction, if you don't make those changes for regulation, if you don't create the friendliness of policies, if you don't take away the barriers that do not enhance the benefits or do not reflect the benefits of a blended finance transaction, progress will be very limited in that sense. So, for example, the use of guarantees is something that we're seeing more and more at a global scale for several reasons. One, because they are very effective in the sense that they don't tie up capital or cash flow. It's more the contingency or whoever is providing the guarantee. But now the question is, how do the regulators, let's say in the banking system or in the asset management world or in the capital markets or in the insurance regulation, how do they make allowances for that guarantee? Do they take the guarantee one-on-one? How do you do the bookkeeping for that? What will be the requirements? Because if there is a disconnect from the benefits of those guarantees, the credit enhancement that it has, and that is not reflected in the books of the investor, then the investor will likely walk away from it, because they say, even though the credit risk might be covered or partially covered, I still have to reflect this in my books, and therefore I need to answer to my shareholders. And there might be a perception there that either you're going against your mandate or you're not fully aligned with the fiduciary responsibility that you have. That's the first one, and then the second one, I think, which is, and going a little bit back to your previous question, Doug, has to do with the initiatives that you had mentioned, and there's also the initiative of EcoInvest, which is a great investment, a great initiative in Brazil in order to try to deal with, I think, a challenge that we see that is still being grappled with by several organizations and by several sponsors of deals, and that has to do with the foreign exchange risk. That it can be mitigated to a certain extent. It is expensive to do so. There are mechanisms, but the question becomes, how can we not completely, but significantly reduce the cost of the foreign exchange, especially when you consider a region like Latin America, where each country has their own currency, except for some that have follow the U.S. dollar, but each has their own currency. So therefore, you have to operate at a very local level in order to deal with the currency volatility that there is. And one way to do that is by fostering local resource mobilization, so that the assets and the liabilities locally are matched, and then you somehow mitigate. Yes, you somehow mitigate the foreign exchange issue there when you're mobilizing or blending at the local scale. Obviously, if you're opening up a transaction for the international flows of funds, then you will incur the FX exchange. But I think that is the next frontier, if you will, to see how we can channel and mobilize those foreign resources with a better conduit of the foreign exchange risk that's present.
That's a really, really impactful insight, Heiner, in terms of how can we boost this kind of operations here in Latin America. And I'd like to make one comment on your answer. We held an event a couple of weeks ago here at one of our partners' offices, talking specifically about the regulatory landscape here in Brazil and how this regulatory context could somehow allow or, be something that we should avoid in terms of promoting more blended finance operations here in Brazil. So the regulation aspect of it, we agree that's a key aspect of this, and not only Latin America, but here in Brazil as well.
It is a key, and again, my impression from last year and from this year, being this week here in Sao Paulo, has been very positive, because there is that openness and there is that willingness to create the right regulation. Just building a little bit on that also, I think it's important to draw experiences on similar countries or similar regions in order to enhance or speed up the regulation that's required. I think the economic development world is very collaborative. I think there are institutions worldwide that try to share their best practices. So let's not reinvent the wheel in many cases for what has been done as far as regulatory aspects, let's say in the banking sector. I'm talking local again. I'm not talking international standards. I'm just talking local. But banking sector or insurance sector, in order to be adopted with the allowances that the current context requires. So it's not imposing what has been done in another region, but it serves as an inspiration and as a baseline for what has worked or what has not worked in order to avoid it and not incorporate it into new policies or new legislation.
100% agree on that. And here we talk a lot about the one side of the equation, which is how can we structure in terms of finance and regulatory aspects of it. I'd like to bring to the table the other aspect of the blended finance operation, which is the business side. Like the operations that could be invested. Do you think that we have how do you think the pipeline of these projects are going on in Latin America? And if you guys have any data within Convergence that you'd like to share, I think that's very important, because here, Marco, one of our founders, always say, okay, the finance should serve the business, and not the business should serve the finance side. So I'd like to hear a little from you about the business side of it.
I agree with Marco in that sense a little bit, but I agree in the positive sense. I agree in the sense that it's not sufficient to say, oh, there is no pipeline, therefore I will not invest, or there is no pipeline and therefore I am not interested in blended finance transactions, if you want to be extremely drastic, right? I think pipeline will build itself pari passu as the industry grows as well, okay? And it'll grow, I think, at a faster rate in certain sectors and in certain countries than it will in other more challenging sectors. So, for example, what I mean by that is that let's not forget that in a blended finance structure, we have those two components, right? We have that concessional capital, that catalytic capital, which is okay with being patient. It is okay with lower returns. But the private investor, the commercial investor, needs those market returns because there's an opportunity cost for them. They have a mandate and they have. So whatever initiative is being tackled with or encapsulated within the blended finance solution has to have a business model or a revenue generating model. And I think that's where we have to be creative, because some sectors are more challenging to identify that revenue-generating model. I think great progress has been made, or great market formation has been made, or price formation and market formation has been made, for example, with the carbon credit markets, where you already have the monetization of certain efforts, if you will, that adds to the revenue stream. Biodiversity credits is a little bit more challenging, but it's one more step ahead. And then if we want to touch a little bit more on what's coming, especially on more challenging sectors, let's say like education or health, perhaps it's the creation of a new social credit that somehow captures the benefits of funding certain challenging SDGs, for example.
That's really nice, and 100% agree when you say about the necessity of the business model really somehow respect this cost of opportunity from the commercial capital, right? Otherwise, it won't be like a perfect match between both the finance side and also the business side, right?
Absolutely. And let's not also forget also that many asset owners or institutional investors or like pension funds, for example, or insurance companies have a continuous inflow of funding that they need to allocate.
Sure.
So the supply of funding will be there. Again, once you start looking at blended finance structures as an additional, not the only, because it's not the silver bullet, but as an additional way of mobilizing resources, that will continue to create and also scale these pipeline opportunities or replicate these pipeline opportunities. So whatever worked on the other side of the world, if the conditions are similar and the predisposition is there and the market conditions and support is available locally, then perhaps you can replicate that idea locally and also reach the same impact or development indicators that you attained in a different side of the world. Yes, in a proven model.
Sure. Now we're going to move to question 4 regarding innovation and emerging models, Heiner. We have been tracking how blended mechanisms are blending not just capital, but also logic, impact-linked loans, result-based payments, carbon-linked instruments. You also mentioned guarantees as something that's growing a lot. I'd like to take your impressions. What's coming next? So what innovations do you see as most transformative for the next 5 years, Heiner, in this context of global blended finance?
I see 2. And in order to get straight into the answer, I just wanted to give some background. One has to do with the fact that most of the traditional blending archetypes that we have seen, because there are different types of archetypes to blend. Blending is a structuring approach. It's not a vehicle. So you can blend the vehicle in different ways. And most of the archetypes that we have seen have focused on the de-risking component at the very beginning or at the initial onset of that solution. Sort of at the ex ante of the solution taking place, if you will. What we're trying to see, for example, where we're starting to see now is a little bit, because of the scarcity of donor funding, a little bit of the scarcity of that catalytic capital is doing the blending in a certain way at the very end, and that comes via results-based financing, for example. So in order for you to not create the conditions a priori to the solution, so that it's de-risked there, you're providing a reward or some sort of blending at the very end of the solution, and that comes via results-based financing, for example. So if the conditions and the metrics are completed, then you apply the concessionary terms and the catalytic capital. So it's a little bit blending at the end rather than at the beginning. And then something else that we've seen as well, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Doug, is that guarantees are becoming more and more common, because a guarantee at the end of the day is a contingency. It's the good faith of whoever is issuing that guarantee. They don't necessarily have to front the capital at the very beginning or have it set aside. It's that bona fide determination of whoever is providing that guarantee, that in case a loss occurs or in case an event takes place, they will be able to come up with that.
Cool. And do you think that could blended finance become the connective tissue between carbon markets, green bonds, and climate funds? Talking specifically about climate right now, Heiner.
I think there's a role for blended finance in every market, and I think there's a role for blended finance in each sector and in each instrument. Ideally, what you're trying to do with blending is start creating a de-risking. And what are you trying to do with that de-risking? You're trying to create the track record or generate the information or generate the technical expertise so that that solution becomes more and more common. And at the very end, it would require less and less blending. It then becomes sustainable, and then it becomes scalable, and then it becomes replicable. So, for example, if we look back a little bit at how the microfinance industry started 40, 50 years ago, it was heavily blended. It was heavily the investors are very skeptical about the microfinance sector itself. And with time, anecdotally, the degrees of blending have been less and less and less. And we're starting to see that also with renewable energy projects, for example, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's small scale. The business model starts to kick in. The industry starts to, or the sector starts to take shape and form. There's more information there. Investors already have a better understanding of how to conduct the due diligence, what to look for as far as their risk metrics are. And insurers and or providers of the guarantee also have more information to build on and in order to price that risk accordingly. So it's a matter, I think, of having the information, the quality of the information, and how you're using that information in newly developed sectors.
That's really nice to hear, and this comparison make it very, very clear. One thing that every time takes to me thinking about that, we maybe have to be a kind of patience because the sectors takes times to grow, to generate the evidence and so on. However, when you look at the emergence of climate solutions for a world, for next generations, it's very high. So trying to balance how can we wait for this sector to grow, to get mature, to have this evidence? Okay, but we need to act right now. How to balance that on your vision? I know there's no answer for that, but your point on that.
I have no magical solution. I'd like to tell you, you want to go fast, but take it slow, or gain time, but try to pause in the way. I don't have an answer for that, but yes, it will take time. I think we will get to the point where blended finance will continue to be a household name, where green bonds, for example, will be more of a common instrument. Let's say the carbon market will be friendlier, and I think right now the investor mobilization is more at a corporate/institutional level. What do I mean by, or wholesale level, I should say? What do I mean by that? The fact that the individual investor, the retail investor who has 100 reais or 1,000 reais is not accessing or funding or investing in these types of instruments yet, okay? And it's either because they're not there or simply because they're not aware or they're not interested for the time being. But sooner rather than later, if we have a significant large investor base who says, I want part of my pension fund or part of my mutual fund or part of my savings plan, whichever bank or savings institution have it, to be allocated to these specific sectors, then that will also move the needle significantly because we're talking about mobilizing resources at the retail level as well. And then it becomes also a common practice and an acceptable practice.
That's really
by the investor population in general.
Do you have something similar to this somewhere in the world right now, or?
I'm not aware that instruments do exist. Most of the blended finance transactions, the average of the blended finance transactions in Latin America are around $50 million. And that comes for a reason. That comes because it's more manageable in the sense that it breaks the threshold of the cost benefit relationship for due diligence from institutional investors or investors. They generally don't, the cost for a due diligence in a particular instrument for an investor is pretty much the same regardless of the amount. So whether they invest $5 million or $50 million or $100 million, the cost of the due diligence is the same. So they try to go after larger tickets, and they also have restrictions as far as not being able to purchase, let's say, 20% or 30% or 40% of a vehicle or of a bond, etc. So we've seen that the sweet spot, let's say, for the sponsors and for the investors alike is around $50 million. So not at the specific retail level, but I think it's just a matter of demand before there's a critical mass and the market responds to those types of requests by having specific vehicles that make allowances for that type of ticket size.
Hope so. It gets very, very soon.
Everybody will be invested in everybody. All 6 billion, 8 billion of us will be doing blended finance transactions. That would be amazing.
Heiner, in the Go Blended journey that we have been developing for the last 3 years, we have been trying to build exactly that, a Brazilian ecosystem of investors, public banks, and project developers who can co-design blended models suited to our context, specifically here in Brazil. If you could give one message to the Brazilian ecosystem right now, what would it be like? Where should we focus on our energy in the next 12 to 24 months. I know that in the next coming days we start one very important event here, but what message would you share with our ecosystem?
I have two messages. The first message would be continue doing what you're doing. I think there's a great dialogue between within the private sector and between the private sector and the public sector. And it's bringing all actors to the table. Not everybody speaks the same language in the sense that profitability for you or for me is not the same. Expectations are not the same. But alignment of solutions is possible. But that's possible only when you start talking to the different sectors, and when you make allowances allowances for different stakeholders to be able to be present at the table and participate, and see what they need. It's not blended finance shouldn't be an imposition like this is what I have structured. Do you take it or do you leave it? No, it's let's work together. What would you require for your risk reward tolerance for your mandate in order to participate in this solution? Can I craft it that way? That way you can participate. So that dialogue and that coordination, I think, is going. And then something going a little bit to also as to where we were going. I had mentioned the results-based financing, which is more blending at the end rather than at the beginning. I think something that's also coming has to do with the fact of standardizing models for blended finance. We worked at the beginning of this year on this initiative called the Private Investment Mobilization Models, which was presented in Sevilla at the Finance for Development Forum. And the idea behind this whole structuring of standard models is precisely to reduce the costs so that each blended finance transaction, let's say, is not completely different, and then therefore you have to spend time on the due diligence, understanding, et cetera, et cetera. And then that way it'll serve as a vehicle for donors and governments alike to fund, because they would be going towards a specific objective, and also the investor community will have a better understanding and be more familiarized and reduce the costs of the time that they would require to do due diligence on a specific vehicles, because they already know that vehicle is going to behave in a certain way with certain objectives and certain metrics.
There's a track record for that.
And a track record for that. Eventually, yes. So that's something that we're looking forward to in the next several years, is standardizing to reduce costs, to reduce times, and to hopefully scale these solutions both within a country, maybe sub-regionally, and maybe regionally as a whole.
That's really nice to hear, Heiner. And commented on the first point that you brought to the table. We usually talk within our Go Blended communities that Go Blended Finance is not a business of finance structuring, but a business of governance, right? It's trying to get all those stakeholders to get to the table, sharing a common vision, and from that we can move forward and discuss the technical terms, right? When you mention like the public and the private sector, it's just an example of that, right? Okay, how can we align these visions to be 100% clear of, okay, what's the outcome that we want, and use blended finance as a tool to achieve that common shared goal, right?
Absolutely. Blended finance is a tool. It is a structuring approach. It is one more alternative for when de-risking. There are obviously instances where simply the numbers don't add up. They will not add up. And then you need some sort of additional funding to address that market failure, right? Whether it may be traditional grants or philanthropy outright, simply because that's what it calls for. But whenever de-risking is possible, whenever it is possible to strategically use that catalytic concessional capital to make the numbers work, then it makes sense to try to explore blended finance.
That's really, really nice, Heiner. Well, we are coming to close our conversation here, Heiner, but I'd like to ask you if the ones that are listening to us and watching this video, how could they access more conversions content and follow the content that you guys produce?
Our website is full of very rich content, very rich examples, very rich training courses on blended finance. We also have a newsletter you can subscribe to. Be part of the community. That's at convergence.finance. And I always like to say, if you're learning to play tennis, for example, or any other sport, the first step you should take is join a club. Start going to the club. So be part of the community. Reach out to Dynamo, for example, who has one of the leaderships of blended finance in the Brazilian market. Reach out to Convergence to see what we have publicly available. Reach out to different Apex organizations, whether it's Anbima, for example, on the capital market sense, and like the analogy with the sports, as you start getting into these clubs or into these settings, then you start playing a little bit more, and then you start realizing what the equipment is, what the different techniques are, and it has to do with being exposed to the different participants and be able to exchange ideas. And like I said, I think it was a fantastic idea, an initiative on Brazil to have B20, to have G20 last year, to have COP30 this year, and the PRI in person here. And I think it's great. So that really gives the momentum and the credibility at a world stage that Brazil is serious about being a leader in climate finance, and setting a reference for the region as well going forward.
That's really nice. We couldn't close this episode with such a insightful and important message. Join the club, right?
Join the club. I like that. Join the club.
All right, Heiner, I would like to thank you a lot for finding a spot in your busy agenda here in Brazil to make this conversation happen. I truly appreciate your time and insights you have shared with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good to be here, and best of luck.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who have been listening to this episode. Blended Finance isn't just about funding projects, it's about designing a smarter, fairer financial architecture for the future. So follow the Go Blended journey for more insights, upcoming roads, and collaborations. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you next for our next episode. Bye bye.